Okay, hello everybody. This is going to be interesting. This is going to be a kind of an impromptu thing, and I'm going to look at doing some of these videos. Actually, I'm going to do a complete series of videos on J.D. Bronger. J.D. Bronger is a local Church of Christ preacher. I think he's semi-retired at this point. But this all actually stems from a debate that I had, last week before, something like that. That was on the subject of AD70 Doctrine. And I actually mentioned J.D. Bronger in my my video. Or, I'm sorry, my, what do you call it? In the debate. I have a quote from him. Now, the reason I have a quote from him is because I listened to a video that he put out. This was on, let me see here. Not that one. July 31st, 2016. So, almost 5 years ago. So, in this video, he mentions me in the video. So, and our congregation. Well, there's a point in that video where I quote what he said. I'm going to show you my quote from him here in just a moment. But see, here's the problem with this. One of the points that I made in the debate was that you have these preachers who are preaching virtually the same thing that I preach. I mean, they go 80, 85, 90% of the way to teaching pretty much exactly what I teach and what I preach and what I say. And yet they condemn me. They use preterist or past fulfillment of prophecy passages and hermeneutics in order to interpret those passages. And yet they condemn me for doing exactly the same thing. Now, I know this is highly a Church of Christ thing. But this information actually is good for not only people in the Church of Christ, but it's just good because it's the truth. So I'm going to spend a little time and we're going to go through this. We're going to, first I'm going to say hey to a couple guys that are joining me late. I just decided to do this. I get kind of tired of these guys getting away with all of their baloney. So I'm gonna say hey to Keith and hey to Bobby. It's not so late for Bobby. Bobby's I think 3 hours behind us, but either way, glad to have you with us. So I'm gonna spend about an hour doing this and going to hey, that wasn't good. Maybe my cable's having some funkiness. So either way, we'll see what happens. So we're gonna get right into this. And let me explain a little bit more of what's going on, why I'm doing this, and the like. Now, these guys are very ambiguous in what they say. That's one of the points that I made in the debate was these preachers walk right up to the line and they're willing to, say you go to heaven when you die. They'll preach it at funerals and whatever else. But when they're really pressed on it, that's it, just one? Well, 1 hour behind. Anyway, sorry, Bobby. It distracts me. They'll walk right up to the line, but they'll say, but when they're really pressed, they'll say, oh, no, you go to the Hadean realm. Well, I'm here to tell you, if you believe that you go to the Hadean realm, let's just lay this out, okay? And we'll go over this in time again, I'm sure, before all of these videos are done. If you just lay this out, here's how I would say this. If you believe you go to the Hadean realm, you're preaching Old Testament. Okay, you're preaching part of the law. You're preaching that Jesus wasn't victorious enough, that his blood sacrifice, that spiritual sacrifice that he made was not strong enough, stronger than the blood of bulls and goats because it keeps you confined to Hades at the point of death. So that's a huge issue that I've got and have had for a very, very long time. It never made sense until I realized, hey, Jesus actually meant what he said. So I want to show you let me get to this. That's the wrong one. I want to show you the clip in question. And we'll play this. It's only like maybe I didn't even spend really a minute on this, but I want to enlarge that. So here we go. I'm going to transition to this. We're going to play this clip. I need to turn up the volume here, and here you go. This is what got JR up in arms, and I'll tell you more about that in just a minute.
But you wait and see. You're going to love it. Verse 13, it's the resurrection at the end of the age. Now listen to this. J.R. Bronger says some of us are going to take the preterist approach to certain passages. It's okay for J.R. to do 80 and 90% of it, but it's not me, I guess. You take, for example, he says, Matthew 24, I'll take a preterist approach to understanding that, well, that applies to the at least part of it does apply to the destruction of Jerusalem. That's what he said. You can see it. There's the quote. J.R. also said there are faithful brethren who conclude that the book of Revelation was written pertaining to the fall of Jerusalem as opposed to the fall of Rome, who are not advocates of this doctrine. I'm telling you here, you got a real problem. If you think that Revelation was written after 70, you've got to be a premillennialist. All the guys in the first century, John's early church fathers that he's going to quote extensively, were pretty much what we would consider premillennialists.
Okay, so I'm going to transition back, and we'll explain a little bit of this stuff here.
Gary Fear.
That's not what I meant to do. We'll explain a little bit of this stuff. Now, the reason that I quoted that, and the reason that I said that, is simply because J.R. is teaching that it's okay. Did you see that last quote there? He's like, well, it's okay for brethren to believe that Revelation was written before 70. And you'll hear this. I'm going to show you the video. We're going to go through the video. I'm going to play a little bit of his AD70 Buster video. And we're not going to play. I'm going to play all of it. I'm going to keep doing these videos until I'm done with that. If it takes me 100 videos. It won't take me 100 videos. But either way. But, he says it's that there are faithful brethren, faithful preachers who advocate for an early date writing of Revelation. Now, I have a real issue with that, because if you're going to advocate for Revelation to be written in 95 or 96, you're going to have to take the premillennial position. You're going to have a temple being destroyed, rebuilt, repopulated, the priestly system, Rome, you name it, sacrifices, the whole 9 yards is going to have to come back in order to hasten the coming of Messiah. So I don't have a problem with it being written in 70, and apparently neither does J.R., because J.R. said that there are faithful brethren who take that position, although he disagrees with them. But yet he would not consider me faithful, which is fine by me, because I'm not here to please J.R. or anybody else. I'm here to please the Lord and preach the truth. And this is the truth. So let's get right into this. Let me get this queued up here. Well, I'm just going to start right at the beginning. I think this is at 17 seconds. And I will stop, and we will... How do I do this here? We will... let's try this. This one, maybe? Yeah, I'll just do this one. And anyway, I'll just stop every once in a while, and we will talk about whatever's going on here. So let me get this started
I'm going to be, this morning, dealing with a subject that I have dealt with before from this pulpit and in many other venues. And it is because it continues to be something that, well, it just seems like it has legs. It just continues to be something that needs to be discussed. And so as I get into the study, you're going to immediately recognize, many of you who are members of this congregation, going to immediately recognize the subject matter and perhaps even the reason why we need to talk about it. And I want to say at the outset that it's not going to be one of these, getting into your heart, encouraging, pumping up kind of lessons, because it's going to be dealing with some things that just simply have to be dealt with, simply because of the nature of what it is that we're talking about.
Okay, so let me stop here for a minute. I'm going to try not to get too, how do you put this? I have to flip back and forth here and check my feed and all this every once in a while. I'm not going to get too wound up. Or yes, I am. So we'll just see. I don't know. But, okay, so this is something he has to deal with. Okay, so I guess JR is the self-appointed watchdog. And now he, you know, this is 5 years ago. And coming up on 5 years. And so now he has to set everybody straight. Well, I'll tell you this much. JR refuses to debate me on this issue. I invited him to come on my program and explain stoicheion from 2 Peter 3. As a matter of fact, I would love to have a debate with JR. Let's debate 2 Peter chapter 3. I would love to debate that with him. He believes he's got a really strong argument there about the world being destroyed. I would love to have that debate with J.R. Bronger. So when he listens to this, and the people that are listening to this, tell JR he needs to debate me. And here's the reason why. Somebody told JR that I said that he agrees with me on preterism. And he sent me a message. I'm not going to read it all to you. But yeah, we can do that, Trent. No problem. Anyway, he's where was I at? We've got. Oh yeah, so JR, we need to debate this, okay? So he gets all upset over this debate and me quoting him, and he says I'm not allowed to quote him. But you know what? It's funny that he's allowed to quote me, and I guarantee you that he'll say, "Well, it's been debated." Yeah, sure, JR. You just keep dreaming. Because whatever makes you sleep at night, I suppose. Because here's the thing. You would never say that about a Baptist, a Pentecostal, a Catholic, anybody. You would never say that about them. Well, it's, you know, has baptism been debated and we've debunked the Baptists on that? And the Pentecostals on the gifts of the Spirit? And what about the Catholics on their heresy? So we just don't debate them anymore? Why is it only with preterists that all you got to do is debate them one time and you debunk them? Here's the fact, guys. And for all of you preachers who are out there listening, and JR, I hope you're listening to this. Here's the fact. You know we have got you on the run. You know that we come into your congregation and we debate this, and it changes people's viewpoints and their perceptions, and you are terrified of losing your power and your position. Because we are preaching the first century truth, what you claim you're preaching, and you have no room to back it up. You have no, there's just nothing there. You simply cannot back it up. It's impossible. So, we need to debate this. Let's talk about 2 Peter 3 in a debate. All right, we can do it one night, we can do 2 nights, we can do, split it up over a Saturday, take a couple hours in the morning, a couple hours in the afternoon. Whatever's easier, we can do that. But I don't think we need 4 nights. But the fact of the matter is, he's going to simply deny it. He's going to say, well, no, I'm not debating. I've retired. You haven't retired enough to call me, a coward? This is the best that they've got. Okay, let's review this some more, and we'll just do this thing here. Transition and hit play.
I often begin this study by saying, what would you think if I told you, if I preached to you and I encouraged you to believe these 5 points at the second coming of...
Okay. So I'll pause this right here. So he says, believe you. What would you think if I told you to believe these 5 points? What he's doing is trying to play a mind game with his audience. He's saying these things are so preposterous that you can't even believe them. This is what the apostles taught in the first century, JR. This is what Jesus taught his apostles to teach in the first century, JR. This is what the apostles taught because Jesus taught them, and the brethren believed what they were teaching, that Jesus would return in their lifetime. And we can prove this, and you can't. You just deny it, and then you refuse The hyperfuturists refuse. I call them hyperfuturists because you start talking about this, and boy, do they get hyper. But anyway, so these hyperfuturists like J.R. Bronger would rather teach and preach an absolute blatant lie and deny the words of the Master than they would to simply submit and to do what's right. And I'm calling them out. They are teaching false. They're teaching wrong. They're teaching something that Jesus never taught, and neither did his apostles. And he comes up with this 5-step plan. And he's what he's doing, and he's being dishonest with his audience. And all they can do is misrepresent, misdirect, obfuscate. It's impossible for them to just deal with the questions like I kept asking John Welch. Do you go to heaven when you die? You know, this should be a real simple thing for a Christian to answer, for any preacher to be able to answer. Yes, you go to heaven. Why can't you say that? It's the most Christian thing out there, period. Yes, you go to heaven when you die. Jesus was successful. He was victorious. He opened heaven, and now we've got it. But no, they can't do that. They can't say that. Instead, what they want to do is they want to scare their audience into not looking into this. And this is exactly what he's doing here. He's building his foundation of fright.
Christ occurred more than 1900 years ago. And at that time, Jesus Christ inaugurated the eternal kingdom. Not the kingdom but the eternal kingdom.
I didn't even know what the kingdom is.
And at that time, the resurrection of all the dead happened. Furthermore, at that time, the final judgment took place, and the end of the world happened. It ended more than 1900 years ago at the year 70 AD. Now, if I told you that, if I begin to espouse that, what I have just told you are the basic tenets of the doctrine known as the AD70 Doctrine.
Okay, did you see what he did there? What he's doing, it's just rotten. And this is the best that they've got to offer, is to... I've already been over this. Okay, so let's keep listening. I'm not going to go over each one of those things just now because this is the typical tell them what you're going to say what you're going to say, and then tell them what you said kind of sermon. And this stuff is just going to keep popping up because I don't know how to turn that off. So let's just go on.
And of course, there's a whole lot more involved than just simply that. But this is basically
a whole lot more involved.
The foundation or the basic tenets of that particular doctrine. Now, if you doubt me, let me just put up a couple of quotations there of advocates of this doctrine.
See, they love this. Max King. Max King is the one that started preterism. Got a clue for you, JR, and it's simply this. Jesus started the doctrine that we believe today. There you go. It's that simple. Max King saw a lot of things. Something I've never read anything about. I've never read Max King's works. I've got his book. Somebody gave it to me. I need to read it one of these days. I bet it's pretty good. I bet there's a lot of good stuff in there and a lot of things that JR certainly doesn't see. But I've never read it. I formulated my opinion based on the Bible. There you go.
Max King said back in July 1973 that the Scriptures teach that the second coming of Christ, including the establishment of the eternal kingdom, the day of judgment at the end of the world, and the resurrection of the dead occurred with the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Those are the points that I just enumerated. And that, of course, was espoused by Max King. Furthermore, Charles Geisler said, the Holy Scriptures teach that the second coming of Christ, including the establishment of the eternal kingdom, the day of judgment, the end of the world, the resurrection of the dead, occurred with the fall of Jerusalem. So I'm not misrepresenting the position. I have highlighted with...
So here's what he does. And this is very typical. They will quote other people. What John Welch did with Holger is just reprehensible. They actually edited that out. I'm going to go over that this Tuesday. But they actually edited that out. And it's just a shame. They're so ashamed of what they did that and how they indicted Holger because he was a former Jehovah's Witness. Unbelievable, sickening. These people sicken me, and they are not gospel preachers. They are gossip mongers. They are fear mongers, but they are not preaching the truth. And yeah, here we go.
To you, two statements from those who advocate such as that. But let me kind of explain to you the name, the terminology.
Okay, so here's something else that they have to do. They have to explain to you, because they don't want us explaining it. So when we explain it, it makes sense. So they have to explain it to their congregation. Then their congregation has all this fuzz in their head that makes no sense. And they say, well, then preterism can't be right. Well, this isn't preterism. This is the gospel. Got it? You know, Revelation 19:10, the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. This is the gospel. The testimony of Messiah coming. Yeshua, the salvation of Yahweh coming is prophecy. It's what Paul used for the Bereans in Acts chapter 17. That converted many of them. It's what Paul used, this prophecy and fulfillment of prophecy and prophecy unfolding and then coming to its telos or its end goal, that made the Thessalonians hate him and want to kill him. They don't understand it. So when we preach it and we teach it, it makes sense to people. I cannot tell you the amount of people I have just sat with, gospel preachers, many gospel preachers in the Church of Christ we have had computer studies and phone and whatever else. And we sit down and we talk about these things and they're stumped because it makes sense. You know why it makes sense? Because of this. Jesus said, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see me coming in my kingdom. They can't explain it. We can explain it. He meant what he said. It's real simple. So they have to explain it in order to get you to disbelieve it. So they explain it their way and they misrepresent. Is all they do. Dishonest.
When we talk about the AD70
J.D. Bronger.
We need to point out something
J.R.
that
I
is just
put
not
J.D.
simply
J.R.
talking about whether we accept
As
or
dishonest as they
reject
come.
the early or the latter dating of the book of Revelation. That's not what we're talking about. You know, there are faithful brethren who conclude that the book of Revelation was written pertaining to the fall of Jerusalem as opposed to the fall of Rome.
Okay, so now there is a quote that I used. And he said that there are faithful brethren who believe that the book of Revelation was written to the fall of Jerusalem instead of not pertaining to the fall of Rome. And it's okay for them to be faithful. That's what I advocate. But it's not okay for me because I take it to the conclusion that it was intended. It starts out with being soon in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 1, and then it ends up being soon in Revelation chapter 22, 6 or 7 times? It says, yes, I'm coming quickly. It's soon. It's at hand. All of these things. And so these guys want to just be very dishonest so that they can fit and fill their own prescription for the gospel and for the Bible. And it's just terribly dishonest.
Who are not advocates of this doctrine that I'm discussing. The reason that it's called the AD70, by the way, and you take this position, all of the books of the New Testament had to have been completed before 70 AD if you're going to accept this position.
All right. So let's go over this for just a moment. So were all of the books of the New Testament written before the destruction of Jerusalem? Well, let me illustrate something to you. I'm going to show you in Zechariah. This is so good. Zechariah chapter 13. Zechariah chapter 13, actually 12, 13, and 14, illustrates that in that day, this is the destruction of Jerusalem. Now let me just go through here, and I'm going to count a few of these terms for in that day in Zechariah 12, 13, and 14. So you tell me what day he's talking about. Chapter 12 and verse 1, the burden of the word of the Lord concerning Israel. Okay, you got it? So who's this talking about? He's talking about Jerusalem, this cup that causes reeling. Now notice in verse 3, in that day, there's 1. There's 5. Verse 9 is 6. Verse 11 is 7. chapter 13, verse 1 is 8. Verse 2 is 9. Verse 4 is 10. Chapter 14 in verse 1 is 11. In verse 4 is 12. In verse 6, 13. Verse 8, 14. Verse 9, 15. Verse 13, I lost count. 16, right? And then you've got verse 20, 17. 17 times it talks about in that day. Now, what is the day that is being considered? It's the destruction of Jerusalem. It's the destruction of Jerusalem at the time, ready for this? In verse 10 of chapter 12, when I will pour out of the house on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, so they will look on me whom they have pierced. Is there any question as to the time in history when that takes place? When the Spirit's poured out and they look on Jesus whom they have pierced, they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son. They will weep bitterly over him like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. That is Revelation chapter 1 and verse 7, by the way. So what time is that to take place? Well, it's too confusing if you follow the hyperfuturists and what they're teaching, because your brain's just going to explode. But if you keep it in context, here it is, in that day. Now, that's in the first century. Chapter 13, verse 1. In that day a fountain will be opened for the house of David, for the inhabitants of Jerusalem, for sin and impurity. When was that? Is that yet to come in our future? No. If that's the case, then prophecy continues and inspiration continues, and books of the Bible should still be being written until the coming of the Lord in the future, in our future. But notice what it says in verse 2, Zechariah 13. It will come about in that day, declares the Lord of hosts, that I will cut off the names of the idols from the land, and they will no longer be remembered. And I will also remove the prophets and the unclean spirit from the land. And anyone, if anyone, still prophesies, then his father or mother who gave birth to him will say to him, you shall not live, for you have spoken falsely in the name of the Lord. You can't prophesy after 70 AD, what we now know to be 70 AD, the destruction of Jerusalem. It's impossible. You can't write another book. It's impossible. And people say, well, you're going to tell me that the Apostle John lived past 70 AD. First off, I'm not convinced of that he did live that long. But secondly, it doesn't matter. If he lived past 70 AD and he prophesied, he was telling something, he was doing something that was not authorized. He couldn't prophesy. It was removed. The prophetic office was removed. The unclean spirits passed out of the land at the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. The prophets passed out of the land at the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem in 70 AD. In that day. So, you tell me, was Revelation written after the destruction of the temple, or was it written before the destruction of the temple? As a matter of fact, in that day, it is posited that the Lord will return at that time. Think about this. It's the time when all nations gather together, chapter 14 and verse 2. Against Jerusalem to battle. It's at that time and in that day, chapter 14 and verse 4, that his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. What is that a reference to? Coming judgment of Messiah. It is reference to the time when the Lord my God, at the end of verse 5, will come and all the holy ones with him. Well, what is that? I wonder. So it's this time when the living waters flow out of Jerusalem. When is this? It's this event that's taking place. And we could get really technical and we could say, well, this is when the fulfillment of the feasts were taking place in the lifetime of Jesus, and then during the transition period, it comes to an end 40 years later. There you go. So, the simple fact of the matter is, inspiration ended at the coming of the Lord and the destruction of Jerusalem, as evidenced by the temple when it fell. So, they want to promote a narrative that says, well, all these books were not finished. Or, yeah, some were written after 70. Well, you keep dreaming because they're not inspired.
But the doctrine, the 70 AD doctrine, simply is referred to that way because of the emphasis that's placed upon that particular date in history. Furthermore, it's also known as realized eschatology. Eschatology is a word that means the study of last things, or the study of last days. Now, when you take that and you add the word realized or fulfilled, what it tells you is that this is a doctrine that believes and advocates that all of the teaching pertaining to the last days or the end of time have been realized or fulfilled. It's also known as full or hyper-preterism.
Well, I think they're known as full hyper-futurists. Okay? And they are full up to here with their rhetoric. No question about it. And they just keep promoting the same ancient Jewish narrative of the first century that led to the apostasy and the great falling away. And no wonder that people after the destruction of Jerusalem were looking for a second coming. Still. Because they missed it. They were following the Jewish narrative. We'll go over that one of these days.
Preterism comes from a Latin word that means past. And so the idea of a hyper or full preterist is that he believes that all of the Bible prophecies, no matter what we're talking about here, whether the second coming of Christ or the resurrection or whatever, all Bible prophecies have been fulfilled in the past. And so when you hear a term preterism or full preterist or hyper-preterist, that's what you're talking about. Now some of us are going to take the preterist approach to certain passages. You take, for example, Matthew 24. I will take a preterist approach to understanding that applies to the destruction, or at least portions of it does, applies to the destruction of Jerusalem. But a fuller...
Now see, I quoted him on that. And he just got all bent out of shape. And don't you quote me and don't you use my name. Hey, it's a biblical thing to call out people who are teaching something that is not the truth. And you have no problem doing that. These guys have no problem calling us out. So, I just quoted him. I didn't take it out of context. I've listened to this, I can't tell you how many times, and it sickens me every time.
Hyper-preterist takes all of the prophecies.
Basically, there is virtually nothing that he says in this that is right. Virtually nothing. I mean, he might give a definition or something that's right about some things. But, no. Wait till you see how he deals with stoicheion.
In the New Testament, that makes them, or considers them to have been realized or fulfilled in the past. And then it's also known as kingism, and this is really a pejorative term, and I don't...
He's 100% right. It is a pejorative term. It's like calling him a Campbellite. Alexander Campbell saw lots of things that were right. No question about that. Max King, I'm sure, saw some things that were right. I don't agree with everything that he teaches, and certainly his position on things now. I think he's still alive, but anyway.
I don't like to use it, but you may hear it used in reference to the man who is most responsible for introducing that to churches of Christ. Man by the name...
I got news for Brother Bronger. Brother Bronger, you need to understand this. That the Church of Christ believed this 2,000 years ago. Only they were looking for it to happen in their future. Okay? In their lifetime. Time and time and time again. How many times do you have to go through the book of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and try to explain away the what? At the end of each chapter, essentially, in 1 Thessalonians, it's clearly stated that they are looking for the coming of the Lord in their lifetime. Wonder why they believed that. Wonder why Paul, under inspiration, would write that. Maybe that's one of those books that was written after 70 that he's talking about that had no inspiration. I know better than that.
Name of Max King, a preacher in Ohio back in the 1970s, began to espouse this and introduce this. Now he did so at first by saying, and this is typical, folks.
This is
He
typical,
did so at
folks.
first by just simply saying, have you thought about it? And see, this is really how that really becomes the embryo. Have you thought about that grows into
Well, it's something that guys like J.R. and John Welch and let's see, I quoted Mike Willis, I quoted Greg King, David Flatt. I can't remember all the guys that I quoted, but that's certainly something that they don't want you to do. They don't want you to think about things. That is equivalent to the Catholic Church in the Dark Ages chaining the pulpits shut with a Bible there and saying, "Hey, no, you know they chained it to the pulpit so you couldn't look at it." We don't want you reading the scriptures. We don't want you thinking.
A false doctrine. Have you thought about, perhaps this is something we had not considered. Have you thought about moving beyond traditional beliefs about these things? And so what began with a study pretty soon evolved into a doctrine and a position. Well, now let's note some things about this. I have a quotation here from Ecclesiastes 1 verse 9 that says, "That which has been is what will be, that which is done is what will be done, and there's nothing new under the sun." Now the reason that I point that out is that this doctrine is not new. It is just a recycled doctrine, as many doctrines are. You know, they crop up ever so often.
So wait a minute. Did Max King come up with it in the 70s, or is this something that's not new?
They're polished up, and they're dusted off, and they're recycled. That's the way it is with realized eschatology, or the AD70 Doctrine. As a matter of fact, what's real interesting about this, and maybe some of you will recall some of the studies that we had recently in the Old Testament.
Let's just see. Let's see. I'm gonna read something here. You ready for this? Let's see if this is being rehashed. Let's see how old this is. James chapter 5 and verse 7. "Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord." He told them to be patient until the coming of the Lord. Are they still being patient? Then he says, listen to this. He says, "The farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it until it gets the early and the late rains. You too, be patient, strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near." How much clearer does that have to get? Just saying. Then he goes on to say, "Wait a minute, behold, the judge is right at the door." There in verse 9.
And looking at the history of the Old Testament. You know, when we talk about in our study of Daniel, we pointed out that there are certain prophecies in the book of Daniel that apply to events that occurred between the testaments. That is, between the Old and the New Testament, in what is often referred to as the silent years. Now, part of those prophecies pertain to the Grecian Empire and to the Persian Empire. And we talked about those, and many times we would highlight some statements that are made in Daniel by looking at some statements that are made in the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, just showing a fulfillment. Now, 1st and 2nd.
Now, it's okay for him to quote from apocryphal writings. It's okay. And he can do that because he footnotes it. But you know something? As soon as a preterist refers to Josephus, they want, it's just so dishonest, guys. And JR, if you do that, you're just as dishonest as every other charlatan that comes down the pike.
Maccabees are books that are accepted by some as legitimate books. But most Bible scholars recognize them as apocrypha or doubtful books. that do not belong in the canon of the Scriptures. However, they are interesting as far as historical documents are concerned, because they shed some light upon some events that have been prophesied in the Old Testament. Well, the writers of the books, or the writer of the books of First and Second Maccabees, looked at the events that pertain to Antiochus Epiphanes, and they believe, and we talked about what a bad guy this fellow was. But they thought that he fulfilled the prophecies of Daniel when it come to the abomination of desolation. Back in 145 BC,
Okay, so this is why these books are not included in the canon. Because they are not inspired. Because these guys thought that this was the abomination of desolation that took place, or I'm sorry, that was prophesied in Daniel, doesn't mean that it was. And he's saying that it was. What kind of gospel preach, what kind of hermeneutic is that? Now, the abomination of desolation, according to Jesus, was yet to happen at the destruction of Jerusalem. Read Matthew 24.
Doctrine began to be espoused in an interesting form, because he thought that what Antiochus Epiphanes did in the year 145 was the abomination, that is, the abomination of desolation that Daniel discussed, which is central to this idea of of realized eschatology. Well, now the passage that Jimmy read this morning for us in the New Testament shows us that this doctrine was even thought to be real in the first century.
Oh my goodness.
Hymenaeus and Philetus believed and were teaching that the resurrection is already past, already happened. I remember some years ago.
Okay, before he goes into talking about Ron Brewer here, which is who he's getting ready to talk about, which is a member of our congregation. Ron has seen this for a long time, and I give him props because he has stood for the truth to a great degree. Okay, so how does he make this connection between his first section on the slide and then the second section on the slide? How does he go from there to there? It just shows that he does not understand history. He doesn't understand hermeneutics. And I'm telling you, this is a guy that I used to have a tremendous amount of respect for. Tremendous. I do not. He is not teaching the truth. I love his soul, but he is not teaching the truth. And this is nothing but a smokescreen to sound like he's saying something, and then the people that listen to him, who have that tremendous amount of respect for him, still, they just go, "Oh well, yeah, that must be right." It's a pure abuse of the trust that has been given to him.
Sitting across the table with the man who advocated that, who used to be a member of this congregation. And I asked him about that. I said, well, aren't you teaching the exact same thing that Hymenaeus and Philetus taught? And his response to me was, yes, but they were wrong and I'm right. Well, that makes a lot of sense. But this doctrine arose then. But it did not, it didn't catch on, didn't have any legs at that time.
Okay, I'm gonna go over this a little bit. Okay, so I want to talk about. Yes, he did, Bobby. He did just say that. Okay, I want to go over this doctrine of Hymenaeus and Philetus. So let's go over here to 2 Timothy, right? Because this is blatant, willful disregard for the Scripture. He pulls this out of context. And I bet you anything that he's never even considered what I'm getting ready to say. So in 2 Timothy chapter 2, now remember, we're very, very good about quoting 2 Timothy 2:15, okay? So we quote, "Be diligent to present yourself approved to God as a workman who does not need to be ashamed, accurately handling or handling right the word of truth. Okay, so we quote that. We have no idea what it's all about. Now, look at what's taking place here. Verse 16. He says, avoid worldly and empty chatter, for it will lead to further ungodliness. Their talk will spread like gangrene. Among them are Hymenaeus and Philetus, men who have gone astray from the truth, saying that the resurrection has already taken place, and they upset the faith of some. Now, why would the faith of some be upset if the resurrection had already taken place? Well, let me show you something. This is Matthew chapter 24. Okay, so follow this chain of logic. There's plenty of other proofs that we can look at, right? But let's look at this one. So Matthew chapter 24. Notice here in verse 26. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Or behold, he's in the inner rooms, don't believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming or the parousia of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, the vultures will gather. So he just said that the parousia, this royal coming of Jesus, of himself, of Messiah, will happen when the vultures are gathered together and the corpses are there. Okay, this is a representation, or the eagles. Look at your footnotes. Look at the original language. The eagles, this is the standard for the representation of Rome. And you've got all these dead bodies, and Rome is present at this destruction of Jerusalem, and this is when the parousia of the Son of Man is. Okay, this is real simple. So when you've got Jesus coming, his second coming, his parousia, it's for judgment, resurrection, at his second coming, at his parousia. Okay, those are the big three: coming of the Lord, resurrection, and judgment. Right? Let's keep reading, though. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken, and the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now, what is that we just read, that these angels are coming to do, to gather from the four winds of one end of the sky to the other? Guys, that's resurrection. That happens at the judgment. That happens at the coming of the Lord. And now notice this. He says, now learn the parable of the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. We just read James quote this, right? Remember from James 5? Right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So Jesus just said that the sun and the moon and the stars are going to fall, the resurrection is going to take place, judgment's going to happen, and I'm coming where the eagles are gathered, at where all of these dead bodies are. Now, why would Hymenaeus and Philetus saying and preaching and teaching that the resurrection had already taken place? Why would that upset the faith of some? Because Jesus said, when the resurrection takes place, I come and it's judgment. And these guys were removing one component of that and saying the resurrection has already taken place. You missed it. And they're going, well, wait a minute. There's no way we could miss this, because this was the coming of the Lord. We would see the signs in the sky. And Hymenaeus and Philetus were teaching, oh no, you missed it. That's why their faith was upset. Because they disconnected the resurrection from the coming of the Lord and judgment in their lifetime. They disconnected it. Now, if that's not enough, I want to show you a little bit more about this. So go back to 1 Timothy chapter 1. Ready for this? 1 Timothy chapter 1, and in verse 18. This command I entrust you to Timothy, my son, in accordance with the prophecies previously made concerning you, that by them you fight the good fight. Well, what's the good fight? What is the good fight? The good fight is contending about the coming of the Lord and standing for that. Notice there in chapter 6, verse 14, he says that you keep the commandment without stain or without reproach until the appearing of our Lord Jesus Christ, which he will bring about at the proper time. What was Paul teaching Timothy? That Christ was coming in his lifetime. But Hymenaeus and Alexander were teaching something else. Verse 19, back in chapter 1. Keeping faith and a good conscience, which some have rejected and suffered shipwreck in regard to their faith. Among these are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have handed over to Satan, so that they will be taught not to blaspheme. What's blaspheming? Let me show you what blaspheming is. You go to Matthew chapter 12. In Matthew chapter 12, we can see that blasphemy of the Holy Spirit causes a person to lose their soul. This is exactly what Paul did. He handed them over to Satan. In Matthew chapter 12, and we'll not spend a whole lot of time here, but in verse 30, you've got this unpardonable sin. What was this unpardonable sin? It was blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. If you look in verse 31, therefore I say to you, any sin and blasphemy shall be forgiven people, but blasphemy against the Spirit shall not be forgiven. What's the context here? The context is witnessing the miracles, witnessing the confirmation of Messiah and denying it. That's blasphemy. Okay? Look at the context of Matthew chapter 12. Jesus heals on the Sabbath. The Pharisees said, no, you're not allowed to do that. They blaspheme the Holy Spirit. It's right there in front of you. You see the power of it, and you blaspheme God. You deny it. That's what was going on in 1 Timothy. Hymenaeus and Alexander were blaspheming. They were denying the power of the miracles and the signs and the prophecies being fulfilled. And they were using it for their own personal gain. That's what everything essentially in 1 and 2 Timothy is about. 1 Timothy opens up talking about these men who teach strange doctrines in verse 3. We see how these overseers and these deacons are supposed to stand against this kind of false teaching and teach the narrative that Jesus is coming in their lifetime. Keep expecting it. And then we see in chapter 4 of 1 Timothy that the Spirit explicitly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons. Now, when can doctrines of demons and deceitful spirits occur? Not past 70. It's impossible. These latter days cannot go past 70. We already talked about this in Zechariah chapter 12, 13, and 14. Remember, we just did that a little bit ago. Okay? Then, I know I'm skipping through a lot of this. You get into the second chapter, the second letter to Timothy, and it's all about this. He says, look at this. This is just amazing. Knowing what the context is now about Hymenaeus and what they were teaching, how they were removing the resurrection from the equation. Verse 8 of 2 Timothy 1. Do not be ashamed of the testimony of our Lord. What's the testimony of Jesus? The spirit of prophecy, Revelation 19:10. The testimony of Jesus is prophecy. And he said, don't be ashamed of this. What was the prophecy? Jesus was coming in their lifetime. Hymenaeus and Philetus were teaching that the resurrection had taken place separate and apart from the destruction of Jerusalem and the coming of the Lord and judgment. There you go. That's why the faith of some was being destroyed. JR and upset. JR has no idea about Hymenaeus and Philetus. He just wants to pull it out of context, which is very typical. Very typical of the hyperfuturist who wants to it's just drive-by shooting. They're just making their point and they're just spraying all over and hoping that they hit something. And the only thing that they're missing is the mark. All right, let me go back to this. And let's listen to a little bit more. We got a little more time.
But it had enough life to be resurrected. Then we find in the 17th century a Jesuit priest by the name of Louis de Alcazar began to teach that all, or most of all, the book of Revelation was fulfilled.
Hey, let me point something out about Alcazar. I haven't read a lot about him. I don't know what his motives were, but let me point something out. It doesn't matter what his motives were. He saw some of the basic tenets of it. And this isn't something that came about from Max King or James Stuart Russell. This is something that he got out of the Bible. Now, whether he was using it for evil motives or for pure motives, it does not matter. He got it out of the Bible. He saw it. There you go.
In the first century with the fall of Jerusalem. Later on, a congregational minister by the name of James Russell in 1878 wrote a book on the parousia, that is, the coming of Christ, in which he advocated that this had already passed. And so, like I say, it's not anything new. Max King just revived what this congregational preacher and this Jesuit priest had begun to espouse some years before, that Hymenaeus and Philetus
Really?
also espoused, and the writer of Maccabees began to think had already occurred. Now let me point out to you.
He has got... Does anybody else see this? He has got preterism being taught from what did he say? 174? I think it's actually 168 or something like that. I don't know. BC to Max King in the 70s. But then he says it's something new. Do you see? They're all over the board with this. All you got to do is just look at this. And you can see that they're not being honest with their arguments. I need to check my time here. Yeah, we got a little more time. Let's do a little bit more. Okay. Here he's going to talk about how militant we are.
And this is one of the reasons why elders and preachers and churches need to be aware of this doctrine. This is a militant doctrine. It's not simply viewed as a matter of judgment. It is a militant doctrine. That is, those advocates of the 70 AD position are militant in their efforts to teach this doctrine. Let me give you...
Here he is. This is what they do. This is classic fear-mongering. They want to scare the socks off of their adherents, the people sitting in the pews. They want to scare them so that they would not even consider talking with me or anyone else. They see me coming into a congregation, and as soon as this COVID stuff is lifted, I'm back out there. Okay, so just a warning. And here's what they do: they tell me to leave. They tell me I'm not welcome there. Okay, I'm a lost soul, and they've got the truth in their mind. And they will not even bother to talk to me about it. They just tell me to leave. They grab my arm and they pull me out of the church building. They usher me out. I'm just not saying that's ever happened, kicking and screaming kind of deal. But yes, there's been physical contact, not on my part. This is how afraid they are of facing the truth. This is why they crucified Jesus in the first century. Because when you are terrified of the truth, you will do anything that you have got to eradicate it, including getting physical. By the way, that's all they're about, is the physical. So it just kind of stands to reason.
Let me give you for instance on this. I was corresponding with one who had recently been converted to accept this doctrine. And this personal letter to me, this individual says, becoming a preterist was not something that I just decided to do one day. When, and he mentions the friend's name, told me about it, I thought he had lost his mind. I made every attempt I could to find cracks in his theology. Since all of my attempts to destroy it failed, I was then sold out and had to believe what the scriptures say.
I don't know who wrote this letter to him, but you want to know something? he's got it right. You can't find cracks in the theology. Jesus said, there's some standing here who will not die until they see me coming in my kingdom. It is that simple. No cracks, no loopholes.
And so with this, it just kind of, I just want to kind of share that with you to show you that this is not something that somebody just, sits back and accepts. Well, it's just my belief. It's just my opinion. I'm not going to teach it. Not so.
I want to make a comment about this. I don't think there's one of us gospel preachers in the Church of Christ who advocate the same gospel that the apostles did in the first century. Today it's called preterism or AD70 doctrine. It's called Christianity. And this is first century Christianity, whether they like it or not. We are preaching what they taught in the first century. During the time of the writing of the New Testament, we're teaching the same thing. Now, I don't expect someone just to say, oh yeah, you're right. I want them to investigate it. Never, ever, even when I was a futurist, did I expect someone just to say, oh yeah, well, you're right, and just baptize me. I never expected that. But there are things, and this is powerful. This is one of the things that I tried to address in that debate. I actually had a strategy for that debate. And it was to get people to think. I was there in the Church of Christ at High School Road, and they hated me. There was one man who came up, I don't remember what night it was, might have been Tuesday night, and he put his finger in my face, and he was telling me how evil I was, and I'm going to hell, and he's virtually yelling, yes, I'm not exaggerating this, ask Trent. And he tells me, I love this part, he tells me with his finger in my face, your mother is ashamed of you, because he knew my mom. You know what I said? Go ask my mom. She's not ashamed of me. I love it. That was pretty good. But so what they want to do is they want to make it sound like that we're out there and we're beating people up and forcing them. That we're relentless. You want to know something? If you've got the truth, you better be relentless with it. That's what they were in the first century. And this watered down preaching and Christianity that people have in today's churches is not the New Testament church at all. It's nothing but capitulating to the pop religion of the denominations. And the Church of Christ has not only dipped their toe in that water, they have cannonballed right in with them. Makes me sick.
They're militant in this. They seek to make converts. They have thousands of websites that are easily accessed and many people access them. Whether you're talking about Preterist
thousands.
Archives or Planet Preterist or Preterist Vision, these are all out there and people are accessing these on a regular basis. You can find article after article after article after article that espouses this.
Is that a bad thing?
Furthermore, on the north side of Indianapolis, there's a congregation known as the North Indianapolis Church of Christ that are full preterists. That is their belief. And those who were former members of Traders Point know who I'm talking about when I mention these people. Furthermore, they have a Bible college, the Northeast Ohio Bible College, which is a full preterist Bible college where they're turning out their preachers.
I've
they're
never heard
turning
of
out those who are
maybe it exists.
enough
I don't
to try to teach this and try to influence as many people as they can to accept this particular doctrine. Now, I've got
Here
this
it
shattered
comes.
glass up there just simply to illustrate something to you. This is a doctrine that has
Shattered tempered
affected
glass is called
and
color.
harmed area churches.
I was in the
Churches
business.
that we are familiar with. Now, I'm going to mention some churches here, not because they have accepted this, but just simply to show you that they have experienced some problems.
Here he goes,
to the
scaring
87
people again.
doctrine.
This
My
whole thing
first
up to this point has been
encounter with
about
this
scaring
goes
the
back
brethren.
more than 25 years ago when it was being advocated down at Biltmore Gardens
That was Ron
And one of
Brewer.
the young men that was preaching down there began to have some issues with a man who was a member there, who was advocating this, who was seeking to teach that. So that caused a problem way back a long time ago down at Biltmore Gardens. The problem then erupted again right here. And this congregation
Guess who that was?
had some
Ron Brewer.
problems pertaining to this particular doctrine that had to be addressed, and consequently was addressed, and I think in an excellent and a good way. But again, it simply is not something that dies down. After I moved to begin working with this congregation,
Let me explain this. So he's talking about these area congregations. And there was a man, and he's a member of our congregation. Some of you know him and have met him. His name's Ron Brewer. Ron would simply ask them. He wouldn't say, you have to change, or he would say, here's what I see. He would go to the preacher. And as he tells it, at Danville, when Mike Willis was preaching at Danville, he talks to Mike, and Mike doesn't have the answers. And as I understand it, Mike kind of went to bat for him to say he's just trying to find the answers. And of course, I don't know. I wasn't there, but I'm just telling you, they get hyper. These futurists, they get hyper. They hyper react. They hyperventilate. They go hyper when someone says Jesus has already returned and kept the promises that he made. So we go. Just here you go. Listen some more.
the North Indianapolis Church of Christ moved en masse and began to attend at Traders Point, and began to infiltrate into the homes of people, and began to advocate this and from their bench or from the seats in Bible classes, until, and God bless him, one of the elders stood before the congregation and told that group, "We know what you're here for and what you're trying to do, and we're not going to accept it. You might as well go back to where you came from." Now,
okay, so let me tell you a little bit about this, because some of these people are now at our congregation, and they are fine Christians, and I would recommend them to anybody. They know the Bible, and they are convicted, and they went there because they wanted to worship with brethren. And they were told to leave. They weren't preaching anything. They weren't teaching anything. They were attending. They freaked out at Traders Point. Now, they'll never tell you that story that way. But the brethren that I worship with tell it different. Who do I believe?
a lot of people looked at that and said, "Whoa, that elder said," hey, no. He was looking out for the well-being of the flock, and God bless him for his foresight and his willingness to do that.
Yeah.
But the problem did not die.
He squelched the truth, is all he
The
did.
problem continues to exist. Greencastle has had to deal with it, and I understand, in a good and godly way.
All right, Trent, you're up next.
Heights,
Greencastle.
Avon had to deal with it, and now it has cropped up again on
That's
the
where I
west side
preach.
with the West Side
West Side.
congregation. So this is not something that's going to, just kind of...
So he illustrates 6 congregations here who had the truth in their midst, and only one of them accepted it. Praise God for the West Side Church of Christ.
Die on its own. It must be stamped out. And it's done, I don't mean that in a literal way, but I mean by the teaching of Scripture. We've got to arm ourselves to be able to handle that.
Oh, that's funny. We've got to arm ourselves to be able to handle that. Here's how they arm themselves, guys. You know what they do? Here's how they arm themselves. You're wrong. You're going to hell. Well, that's great biblical exegesis. Well, that's not what Jesus meant. Soon doesn't mean soon. They say we changed the meaning of words. No, not even close. That's just their spiritual hot chocolate trying to comfort their soul. Let me give you some advice here. Those of us preaching the truth, I see Chucky on here. I see Bobby Allison. I think did I see Bill earlier? I can't go through this whole list. these preachers that are standing up in the pulpits of the Church of Christ in this country are standing for the truth in spite of the ramifications. It's just that simple. They are preaching the truth. And they know their Bibles. And these hyper-futurists, the best they can come up with is to change the definitions, to say God can't tell time, and that that's not really what it means. It's sad. It's sad. You know, not very long ago, I can remember in my lifetime where people in the Church of Christ were known as walking Bibles. Not anymore. Not anymore. They have become just, this is too much. Like everybody else. We want to hear some soft, fuzzy sermons. Bunnies and rainbows kind of deal. Don't preach anything controversial. I remember I started preaching at Westside, where I'm at now. Let me see, about 10, 11 years ago. It's going on 11 years. And the first sermon that I preached was the need for hard preaching. And I still believe this. We have to preach the things that are hard. They're hard to understand. They're hard to deal with. They're hard to swallow because the truth is not easy to accept. If the truth was easy to accept, Donald Trump would be president. Got it? Get the picture? The truth is not easy to accept. And as preachers and as Christians, forget being a preacher, just simply as a Christian, as a first century Bible-believing, baptized into Christ, immersed for the remission of your sins Christian, you have to stand for the truth. You've only got 70 or 80 years to do it. You better start now. Well, walking tracks, that's good. That's very good. I like that. There's no cracks in the doctrine of Jesus. That's excellent, Chucky. Well, I'm a little over time here. Where am I at as far as this? Well, 16 minutes. That still leaves me with 40 minutes left. I can probably do this in 4 or 5 videos maybe. I'm going to stop it right there, and I want to try to keep these around an hour or so. So please share this. I love it. We can send Brother Trusty with you. Awesome. Share this video, okay? Post it on your timeline or share it on your, whatever you call that story thing. If you're a member of the Church of Christ here in the Indianapolis area, let JR know he needs to watch this. And I'm going to go through every last minute of this video personally, and we are going to just keep it up until we're done. We'll try to do this, keep it around an hour or so each time. And hey, I appreciate this. Thank you all so much for taking your time so late on a Friday night. I had no idea I was going to do this. I just thought, I've been wanting to do this for a long time, so I just thought, hey, I got a little time. I'll go ahead and do it, and I appreciate my wife letting me do this because she's getting Easter stuff ready. So anyway, we got the kids, grandkids coming over on Sunday. All right, hey, I love y'all. We're just here to preach and teach the truth, and we're not going to back down. We're not going to shut up. We are going to preach what people need to hear, and that's it. So I'll see you all next time around, and I don't know when I'll do the next one. Hopefully pretty soon. Maybe we can do 1, 2 or 3 times a day till it's done. That's not going to happen. But either way, love y'all. We'll see you next time. Thank y'all very much.